this is a comparative civ-mil relations, civilian control. It's a very interesting topic. There's a lot of literature on it. I wanted to have at least one panel on it to just delve a little bit into the different situations in some key allies and key, you hate to say adversaries, but you know, we'll just say that, and how those civilian control is playing out in those countries differently than in the United States. So to do that, we first have Dr. Thomas Flichy, who's head of the Department of War Studies at Saint-Cyr, French Military Academy. He holds a PhD in legal history and is also a member of the Sorbonne. Following him is Dr. Andrew Scoboll, senior political scientist at RAND in Washington, D.C., and adjunct professor of Asian studies at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. I highly recommend the two books that are listed in the program. They're excellent. And then finally, Commander Frank Goertner, who serves on the J5 as a political military affairs officer for, among other countries, Turkey, about which he'll be talking, and he is an MH-53 aviator also. So, Thomas, up to you.
Everything had been carefully planned. In a world marked by the simultaneous progress of democracy and globalization, the military were a species bound to short-term extinction. Conflicts would progressively dissolve into the market, and high civil servants would soon enjoy the monopoly of thinking without being bothered by the remarks of a few officers who hardly had a brain and sometimes pretended to think differently, as if they could be something else than mere technicians of war. After all, the bureaucratic management of officers had its advantages insofar as it prevented the promotion of the very annoying minority which pretends to have an alternative view of the world. Unfortunately for the technocrats, things did not quite turn out this way. The inevitable progress of democracy proved indeed an optical illusion. Globalization had come to a standstill, and identities suddenly re-emerged. In fact, the massive opening of borders had spawned the clash of identities and the inevitable return of war. Now, would the civilian elites be able to cope with the wars they had unleashed? Were those who had claimed the monopoly of intelligence able to exert their intelligence so as to ensure peace? The answer to the question is only too obvious. They failed dramatically because their technocratic training based on legal procedure and financial management had made them unable to grasp the world as it was in its political and cultural dimensions. They failed dramatically because realities ran against their ideology. And despite the protests of high-ranking officers, wars without purpose were waged. They ended up generally with military victories and political disasters. The soldiers had thus given their lives because of the unforgivable mistakes committed by ideologues, or even worse, the cynical action of lobbyists pushing forward limited wars in order to sell their weapons at a smooth pace. In any case, the creative imagination necessary to overwhelm obstacles in times of troubles was by no means encouraged. This was very clear for the French military, who had in mind the famous book of Marc Bloch, The Strange Defeat, 1940. This book describes how an army of bureaucrats was suddenly defeated by a younger one, which had retained the initiative at the lowest level and, strangely enough, had not decided to wage war according to the rules defined by the French War College. As we know, an army of technicians is unable to understand political realities, especially when it is blinded by ideologues. During the last years, foreign policies have dissolved into their own contradictions. And in France, it appeared very quickly for the military that a supreme technician was now occupying the top of the state. In the same time, certain countries were undergoing a different evolution, placing a prince of war at the summit. Vladimir Putin is such a prince. It also appeared for the military that in times of unrest, the supreme technician was quickly overwhelmed by the prince of war, especially when his competitor had a clear political vision of the world. Lacking public support, the supreme technician had to dress sometimes as a prince of war so as to regain popularity, to regain public support, to regain the confidence of his citizens. And in this respect, the Libyan campaign, despite its disastrous geopolitical consequences for North Africa and Europe, was very helpful for the private interests of President Sarkozy, whose popularity suddenly raised after the first strikes. President Hollande understood the lesson and benefited very much from the Serval operation in Mali. The problem is that stupid military robots, even though confined to their pretended heart of expertise, had realized that wars were now launched for public relation reasons. Military action had become a substitute to a foreign policy, and diplomats had no plan. What should be done with Mali? Elections would be organized and would naturally solve all problems thanks to their magic. What should be done in Syria? No elections this time, otherwise Bashar would immediately be re-elected. The military disasters spawned by the inability of the civilians to determine a policy obviously raised questions among the military. Given that the civilians had failed, the military might be allowed to participate to the political debate. Some officers even realized that their understanding of the world was by no means inferior to that of their civilian colleagues. In effect, the multiplication of military operations since the Afghan war had stimulated the intelligence of the officers' corps. And after all, what is intelligence if not adequacy with realities? On foreign operation theaters, the officers had grasped political and cultural realities which remained mysteries for the civilians locked in their island. During the last 10 years, the relations between civilians and officers in France could be compared to what they were between 1715 and 1789. The armies of Louis XIV dramatically reduced in 1715. We lost 2/3 of our soldiers. The French army operated in the 18th century discreetly on foreign operation theaters, whether in India or in Canada. It operated in coalition so as to reduce the cost of war. Enlightened spirits bought at that time mechanized nightingales, which were to sing divinely, and expected officers to behave as machines, robots. But the comparison with the 18th century has now lost its meaning. war has come back, and the officers know that they might play a growing political role in the near future. A window has been opened just wide enough to hear the song of the real nightingale. And some officers had suddenly the idea that if they allied with the living and creative elites, which had been rejected by the state bureaucracy, they could form an elite of substitution, and that this replacement would be accelerated by the growing internal troubles. The lessons, after all, the lessons of the first weeks of 1914 have not been forgotten, and you know that after a few days, a certain number of officers who had been promoted by the rules of promotion of the time of peace proved unable to command, and in the same time, leaders emerged from nowhere. So the current situation is not that of 1715, but rather that of the beginning of the Roman 4th century. After the financial collapse of the 3rd century, the social troubles, the political disorder, massive migrations, the apparition of splinter kingdoms in Syria and in France, the solution found by the emperor to cope with increasing violence was a militarization of the administration. Officers now served as high civil servants. Of course, the civil-military gap remains in France, and it includes several dimensions. First of all, there's a social gap between the officers' corps, which is naturally and which is culturally dominated by Roman Catholic aristocratic families attached to the defense of France rather than the defense of the Republic. These living remnants of a society which has disappeared now command soldiers who partially belong to the French recent migrants. And this combination forms a kind of colonial structure within France. The civil counterparts of these officers are the children of the generation promoted after the Second World War, a lower middle class without roots and sense of history. Second, there's an intellectual gap between a generation of officers which has broadly rejected the hollow readings proposed by its own educational structure and instead embraced its own romantic counterculture. Third, there's a political gap between an officers' corps which has partially rejected the liberal profession of faith and the high civil servants who have pledged their existence to the defense of the liberal democrat citadel now under siege. Things are changing quickly, and I'm going to give you 4 examples. 4 weak indicators. The greatest demonstrations in France since the Second World War occurred last year. They mobilized several times 2 million people against gay marriage. These demonstrations were headed by General Darry, that you have on the top left corner. General Darry, who had just left the year before. He was military governor of Paris. And the organization of the demonstration was entirely organized by the French army. Second weak signal. The latest demonstration against the migrants of Calais was headed by the former head of the French Legion, General Piquemal, that you have here on the right, arrested by the police a few weeks ago. Third weak signal, General Tauzin, who was the head of the French Special Forces, will be candidate for the next presidential election in a few months. Fourth and last example, General Scoboll, number 3 of the French Gendarmerie. General Scoboll has written a book entitled What Should Not Be Said, and describes the the appalling state of French internal security, this book is #1 on Amazon. He was fired yesterday for his liberty of speech. This means that the dead elites are so frail that they cannot bear contradiction. And under the realm of lie, saying the truth becomes a provocation. Thank you.
So hopefully my slides will magically appear. It's a pleasure to be at this conference on a distinguished panel. I'd like to thank Ed Barrett for including me. The magic, oh, wow. Okay, I have. All right, so I'm on the panel, part of the panel that is about things foreign, the token panel at the end. But I would suggest that there are at least two reasons for being interested in this panel, aside from an interest in the particular country's concern, and that is, how do you know how good or how bad things are in this country where civil-military relations are concerned if you don't have nothing to compare it to? So keep that in mind as I proceed the next few minutes. So I'm going to talk about Chinese civil-military relations. I've been a student of Chinese military for a long time, and I've been thinking about it for a long time, but that doesn't mean I have all the right answers. It's just my interpretation of the state of Chinese civil-military relations in 15 minutes or less. So I've got an outline. I'm going to try and answer three questions. What's the standing of the military in Chinese culture? What special relationships does the PLA, aka the People's Liberation Army, China's military includes, of course, all arms, including the air and naval forces? And how firmly established is civilian control of the military in China today? And what's the key threat to that control? So when we look at Chinese culture, or when you think about Chinese culture, it tends to be conflated with Confucianism. Now, don't get me wrong, Confucianism is very important in China, but it isn't the only school of thought, the only philosophy that has impact in China. There are a number of other ones. I just highlighted two others, Taoism or Taoism and legalism. And legalism is often forgotten about, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment. So not only is Chinese culture or philosophy not monistic, there are misunderstandings about Confucianism. Confucianism is not pacifism. Now, Confucius was a complicated character. He certainly did not talk a lot about, or write a lot about, or think a lot about war. He was more focused on peace and harmony and the natural and the order of how society should be ordered appropriately. But he did not, he did think that there was a role for war and a time for the soldier. It was just the last resort. So when we talk about legalism, as I said, it's one that's people tend to forget about this school of thought. Some have suggested, and I think aptly, that it's parallel in the Chinese foreign policy realm or foreign realm. It's really realism. Realism, the domestic face of realism. So if you look at the chart I have up there, legalism emphasizes punishment, discipline, and a strong state. And who is the protector of that? States don't get created by meditating, as Taoism would suggest, or as preaching harmonious social relationships the way that Confucianism does. It's about creating a strong state. So in short, it's not accurate to paint this picture of Chinese culture being disesteeming the military. It's a little more complicated than that. Okay, so to address the second question, what are the important relationships for the People's Liberation Army? I think there are several. One is the Chinese Communist Party, which I'll talk more about in a moment. The other is the people of China and the state, the People's Republic of China. So first, the people. The People's Liberation Army, as the title might suggest, is supposed to be the army of the people. And of course, officially, the PLA was founded in August 1, 1927. And it began as a insurgent movement. It was a guerrilla force in rural China. And anyone who studied insurgency realizes you can't be very successful as an insurgent unless you have the support of the people. Now, you can intimidate them. If they're afraid of you, that gets you somewhere, but it doesn't get you, it's not a real recipe for success. You need popular support if you're a guerrilla or insurgent force. So from its very earliest days, the PLA emphasized being respectful to the people and treating them as important partners in their struggle against a larger and more powerful adversary. So the 3 rules of discipline, the 8 points of attention, very important in the origins and evolution of the PLA in China. So when political scientists, of which I am one, look at political systems like China, they tend to say, well, it's a dictatorship, it's ruled by a communist regime or party state. If you only have 1 hyphen in there and 2 nouns, you don't have the full picture. In my view, there needs to be 2 hyphens, and you need to insert another word, military or army. So the People's Republic of China, Communist China, is a party military state. There are 3 very large bureaucracies. As I mentioned, the PLA was formally established in the late 1920s, several decades before officially the founding of the People's Republic of China. And from its earliest days, the PLA was intertwined with the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. I've got the first part of Mao's famous quote, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." The second part of the quote's on the next slide. So it was very much seen as the party's army, and after all, the Communist Party didn't win power by an election. They won by armed struggle, and they were only successful because they had a potent military weapon that was loyal to the party. Increasingly, though, I would suggest the state, that is the People's Republic of China, is becoming important, and there are growing links between the PLA and the state as in distinction to the party. But still, it is the most apt way to describe the PLA is it's a party army. So how gets to my third question that I posed at the outset, which is how firm is the civilian control of the military in China? Well, I would suggest to you that it's a very powerful principle. And here's the second part of Mao's famous quote. You know, the party commands the gun, but the gun must never be allowed to command the party. So a strong emphasis on ensuring political loyalty of the military to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, again, I don't want to mischaracterize the situation. If you look at relations between the Communist Party and the Chinese military, there are strong sinews, interconnections, linkages between the two. So civilian control of the military is tightly, firmly established and very well institutionalized. The media in the middle, the median level, and at the grassroots. But at the apex of the system, I would suggest civilian control of the military in China today remains under-institutionalized. So what do I mean by that? Well, when when political scientists try and describe the Chinese political system and talk about civil-military relations, they often identify the Central Military Commission. And there's actually two of them, but they're essentially one and the same: the Party Central Military Commission and the State Central Military Commission. They say that is the mechanism by which civilian control of the military is exercised in China. I beg to differ. There are the Central Military Commission, and we still don't know exactly how many members there are because there's been a massive reorganization and it's still underway, but there is only one civilian on the Central Military Commission, albeit that he's the most important member. But Xi Jinping is the chairman of the Central Military Commission, but everyone else on that commission is a general in uniform, active duty military. So to my mind, that mechanism of civilian control or party control of the military at the highest level is one man, one person, and it's the paramount leader. And in fact, the paramount leader, there's no formal title of paramount leader, but believe me, that's the way it works in China. So the paramount leader of China since the late 1990s has held three formal positions: the President of the People's Republic of China, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and Chairman of the Central Military Commission. And that's very important. He holds those three positions, and that puts him at the apex of power, the most important individual in each of the three bureaucracies I mentioned. And that's particularly important because no paramount leader since Deng Xiaoping has had the stature and military credentials and Deng Xiaoping never only held one of those positions, chairman of the Central Military Commission. He didn't need the rest. Everyone knew he was the most powerful man in China. Today, it's a different story. Go to the next slide. So here are just a quick list of the paramount leaders in China since Mao Zedong. And I would just highlight Deng Xiaoping, number 2 on the list, and then Xi Jinping at the bottom. Now, let's keep moving along. So Xi Jinping, he's certainly not as strong as Deng Xiaoping as a leader of China or a leader of the Chinese military, but he's almost certainly stronger than his two immediate predecessors that I flashed before you a moment ago, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. While he has a greater stature and some degree of military credentials, he still has found the need to burnish his military credentials, to act like China's commander-in-chief or commander-in-chief of the PLA. The photograph on the upper right is of him reviewing troops in the victory over the 70th anniversary of the victory over Japan parade that was held in Beijing last September. So these visuals, these symbols are important because Xi is trying to emphasize that he's the boss, and this is not just to demonstrate to China's soldiers, but also to Chinese people writ large. Despite that, as I said, he is a civilian. He's a graduate of China's MIT, and he has impeccable revolutionary credentials, I should say. His father was a revolutionary, along with Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong. So he has instituted important initiatives in the PLA, including the largest anti-corruption campaign. Anti-corruption campaign, by the way, is another word for purge. And so most of the people he's gotten, the targets of this purge have been his adversaries, or perceived adversaries. Xi Jinping has also launched the most thoroughgoing defense reforms in China since the 1980s. They're still underway, but it's quite remarkable the scope of these changes. And they've been roughly equated to China's, or to the Goldwater-Nichols Act. So it's China's Goldwater-Nichols moment, intent on remaking the military and making it more effective fighting force, and more loyal, just as importantly, more loyal to Xi Jinping personally and to the PLA, to the CCP politically. So another factoid to throw at you, China's First Lady, Xi Jinping's wife, that's her role today, that's her full-time job. But prior to that, she was a member of the PLA song and dance troupe. She's a very good singer, and she was quite a celebrity in her own right, and another way that Xi Jinping was able to appeal to the PLA. All right, so the last question, and I want to be very clear about what I'm saying here too, is the question I posed was, what's the greatest threat to civilian control of the military? I should add, in the minds of China's Communist Party leaders. The greatest threat comes from the United States. Now, we tend to think of China being worried by hard power, U.S. Hard power, particularly U.S. military, the U.S. military. But there's also a soft power dimension to the U.S. armed forces. When we think about soft power and the challenge perceived by Chinese leaders, there's a worry about what's called what the Chinese call peaceful evolution, which is that these pernicious ideas of freedom, democracy, human rights, rule of law, that this is a way that the United States is trying to undermine Communist Party rule, right? Peacefully, gradually, imperceptibly. This is a great plot launched in Washington. Well, having just come from Washington, I'm not sure we're doing such a good job of undermining, but that's certainly the perception amongst Chinese leaders. So, but an added dimension to this is this idea of a national army as opposed to a party army is a great worry to Chinese Communist Party leaders because it threatens to undermine and erode that sacred bond that they believe exists between the party and the army. And this is a tremendous concern. So you have to remember that the U.S. military, from a Chinese perspective, is the gold standard. It's the gold standard in terms of professionalism, experience, capabilities, and so this is a package. This is seen as a package of what a modern military should be from a Chinese perspective. And then part of that package is being a national army, not a party army. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'd like to start off with a thanks to Dr. Barrett for inviting me out here because it's this panel is really a fun way for me to wrap up a 3-year tour on the Joint Staff working Turkey policy. You know, it's not an overstatement to say that the security environment that Turkey faces today is in many ways the most complex, unpredictable, and violent in a generation. And one component of these unfortunate circumstances is that Turkish civil-military relations remain in a near constant state of opaque fluctuation. Now, as someone focused mainly on policy formulation and execution, I'm not going to spend a lot of time this afternoon on the forensics of the social and political intrigue that happened in Ankara and that you can read about in the press. But you know, I do intend to use my remarks here to offer an overview of the key facets of civil-military relations in Turkey that I have tracked in order to help Joint Staff leaders provide best military advice to our policymakers. And then I'll try to summarize briefly how I've seen these facets of civil-military relations reflected in Ankara's approach towards current security challenges, along with some things that we may want to keep in mind as we move ahead with civil-military engagement with our Turkish allies. So when talking about civil-military relations in Turkey, I generally find that a good starting point is to canvass the main players in the Turkish national security policy making and consider the shifting roles of each over the past couple decades. and there have been significant shifts. As those main players have traditionally been on the roster of three offices in Ankara: the Turkish presidency, the Turkish prime minister, or the Turkish general staff, the TGS, as we tend to call them. And given our focus here, it makes sense to launch a discussion with the TGS and then work backwards. So when I first started studying Turkey in the late 90s, one of the unquestioned tenets among Turkey policy hands was that the TGS called the shots in Ankara on all matters related to national security policy and many beyond. And while Turkey remained a functioning democracy with an elected prime minister as head of government and a parliamentary approved parliamentary approved president as head of state, the legacy of successive military coups in 1960 and 1980 was never far from anyone's mind. Under the terms of the 1982 Turkish constitution, the Turkish National Security Council at the time was granted direct authorities for the formulation and execution of nearly all matters of national security policy. And within the National Security Council, Turkish military leadership enjoyed tremendous autonomy and influence. The council was chaired by the Turkish president, but in effect, the commander of the TGS was widely seen to dominate its proceedings. Council decisions were by majority vote. The TGS commander was joined on the council by each subordinate military chief, each of which had their own independent vote. And the Chad had the right by law to propose extraordinary meetings of the Council for emergency decisions. Aside the TGS on the National Security Council, the Turkish Prime Minister constituted the second main constituency in the old order of national security governance in Ankara. The Parliament held legislative authorities and shared the reins of executive authority with the TGS through their Council of Ministers. And the Prime Minister, along with the Minister of Defense, Interior, and Foreign Affairs, held voting seats on the National Security Council, with the commander of the TGS technically reporting to the Prime Minister. That said, these political authorities were generally interpreted to come with an unwritten but well-understood caveat in Ankara, and that was that the National Security Council, under military supervision, retained the right to intervene in the interest of state stability and the preservation of Kemalist ideals. And I'll talk a little bit more about Kemalist ideals in a minute. And the final of the three poles of national security governance was nominally the presidency. And I say nominally because the Turkish president at the time was seen to serve largely a ceremonial and bureaucratic role without any effective executive functions, similar to heads of states and other parliamentary systems. So this all started to change with the 2002 ascendancy of the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And as I'm sure many here remember, the first indicator most Americans caught of that sea change happening in Ankara was with the Turkish National Security Council's surprise 2003 decision against support for the Northern Front in Operation Iraqi Freedom. And I myself spent months of that year shuttling Marines around the Eastern Med to get components of the MU that was supposed to flow through Turkey into the fight. And I can tell you that there's nothing quite like being marooned on a ship in the Eastern Med with a few hundred Marines who are watching a fight unfold 700 miles away that the Army just launched without them. But anyway, among Turkey watchers, we would gradually come to see OIF decision as just the first external symptom of deep changes in civil-military relations that Erdogan, the AKP, would usher into Ankara. In 1982, the 1982 Constitution would remain in effect as it does today, but by the end of 2003, we would see a restructuring of the Turkish National Security Council to considerably dilute the TGS's influence and executive functions. New legislation downgraded the role of the council to an advisory body, added deputy prime ministers as additional civilian voting members, and stripped the TGS commander of the right to call extraordinary sessions for emergency decisions. And over the course of the next decade, we would see additional developments representing a continued power shift away from the TGS. This was, of course, a contentious process, and tensions within the National Security Council reached a boil in 2007 when Erdogan moved to install Abdullah Gül, who was a fellow AK Party co-founder and Islamist, as president. The commander of the TGS, along with several hundred military officers, were accused of maneuvering to block the appointment and fostering plans of a coup against Erdogan and the AKP under a plan termed Operation Sledgehammer. And ultimately, over 300 Turkish military officers were tried, arrested, many of whom still remain in jail for life. The TGS commander and service chiefs would be replaced by appointees of Prime Minister Erdogan and President Gül, And ultimately, by the end of Erdogan's tenure as prime minister in 2014, we saw executive power firmly concentrated in the office of the prime minister. That's not to say that TGS leadership did not retain considerable influence in Ankara, but their new role was clearly constrained to policy implementation and military planning within set parameters as dictated by the civilian leadership from the prime minister. And that's largely where the power distribution remains today, though there are some adjustments starting to take place to accommodate Erdogan's 2014 move from prime minister to Turkey's first popularly elected president. President Erdogan appears to continue to exercise personal authority over national defense policy and military leadership, though because the constitutional role of the presidency remains unchanged, his influence tends to be channeled through the office of his hand-selected successor as Prime Minister, Ahmet Davutoglu. The eventual goal of the AKP remains constitutional reform, the backdrop and executive presidency under Erdogan. And if they can get there through a statewide referendum to institutionalize the presidency as the official executive authority in Turkey. And finally, a recent trend that we sense emerging of late in Ankara is a marginal reclamation of TGS influence. As Turkish security policy becomes increasingly reliant on military response options and plans, there are some signs that the TGS is reassuming a role of leadership or authority within select lanes of defense policy. So that's my rough summary of the key players in Turkish civil-military relations and how I've interpreted their bureaucratic roles and influence to shift over the last 20 years. And then I'd like to shift now to talk a bit about some of the key political ideologies in Turkey that I think influence the landscape of civil-military relations alongside those political maneuvers. So the first one is one I mentioned earlier, Kamalism. And I'm not going to go into the details of the 6 pillars of Kamalism as defined by the father of the Turkish Republic, Ataturk. But I mention it because at least up through 2008, I found that Kamalism meandered its way into nearly every conversation I had with a Turkish counterpart, with particular emphasis to the Kemalist premise that Turkish nationalism and secularism were inextricably interdependent. Indeed, most of these military officers considered it part of their patriotic mission as Turkish officers to guard against any threat to the Turkish state's secular identity. And it was this ideology that underpinned the TGS coups against Islamist governments in the 60s and 80s. Now, I rarely find that it surfaces with any of my Turkish counterparts anymore, but I also have little doubt that it still has its adherents in silent corners of the Turkish military today and will play influence in the future. So the second ideology that plays a significant role is, of course, Islamism. And my sense is that there remains a great deal of uncertainty throughout Turkey on the true nature and extent of the ruling AK party's Islamist agenda. President Erdogan and Prime Minister Davutoglu are unabashedly Muslim, and the AK party has incorporated moderate Islamist tenets into both Turkey's domestic and foreign policy. Overt displays of faith, such as headscarves, have become a routine part of political campaigning throughout Turkey. And Erdogan has not been shy at all about his sympathies for Muslim Brotherhood or promoting the rights of Muslims abroad in Palestine, Crimea, and Syria. But he also shows a high degree of measure and pragmatism in his political postures that keeps pundits guessing as to his true political ambitions. Does he dream of a legacy of a modern caliph, the father of a new republic, or simply the most popular political figure of our time? It's hard to tell because he tends to play into each camp as opportunity may present it. And the third ideology at play in Turkish civil-military relations is Turkish nationalism. So some would consider this Turkish nationalism indistinct from Kemalism. It depends on which camp you would fall into among these. But in my mind, there's an added component of geography in Turkey's brand of nationalism. It's born from a sense of having fought to save a land now called Turkey from the chaotic collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the last century, and a jealous passion to defend its borders from any threat of being redrawn from forces either internal or foreign. And the final ideology I'll reference is internationalism. There's a prevailing pride among most Turks of the immense significance of their unique geographical and cultural position to the region and the world. They're proud of Turkey's stake in both transatlantic and Middle Eastern affairs and the role that Turkish contributions have played in military missions from Korea in the 50s to Kosovo and Bosnia in the 90s to Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa ops today. And I also think this is behind a resurgence of Ottoman symbolism that we see in Turkish political imagery of late. If you want a taste of it, you can Google AKP Ottoman politics or Erdogan ceremonial guard, and if you're a fan of chainmail or fezzes, you won't be disappointed. So that's kind of a summary of key facets of Turkish civil-military relations in Turkey that I keep on my radar. And I'll shift now to briefly highlight some of the top-line examples of how these factors tend to shape Turkey's approaches to and responses towards contemporary security challenges. So I'll leave the one that probably comes to mind first, to most in this room last, and I do that on purpose because I like to run through this list in the order that I think my counterpart on the Turkish General Staff would run through it in terms of their priorities. And at the top of that list would undeniably be the threat of Kurdish militant separatists, in particular the campaign to counter the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK. So for Ankara, the PKK represents the #1 existential threat to the Turkish state. There's no doubt. Their approach for the past year has been a lockstep alignment between the presidency, the prime minister, and the TGS on a campaign to squelch PKK's resumption of hostilities with military strikes both in Turkey and then cross-border in Iraq. And the prism through which they see the threat of PKK insurgencies carries reflections of that Kamalism and Turkish nationalism that I discussed, with their military-centric approach reflecting a possible resurgence of TGS influence in planning and national security decision-making. Next on the list of priorities would be migrant management, particularly as it pertains to the almost 2.5 million Syrian refugees that Turkey hosts. Ankara's approach there has been a policy driven by Erdogan to assure accommodation and support to those immigrants, despite quite a bit of pressure otherwise, in many cases, to clamp down on border security and control the border better from Western officials. And his approach is, really reflective of the Islamist and internationalist influences that we discussed earlier. And then third would be Turkey's posture towards Russian power projection and regional intervention. So obviously, Turkey for decades, and some would say centuries, has been concerned with military encirclement by Russia. And some of those concerns have been rekindled of late in the wake of Russia's military occupation of Crimea, deployments to Syria, and then their sustained forward presence in Armenia and Georgia. And Turkey's approach to these has been largely defensive and reactive, as seen by their responses to Russian airspace violations and pursuit of allied assurance measures. And one can obviously see reflections of territorial nationalism shine through in their responses, as well as their internationalist instincts as they pursue aggressively NATO assurance measures to try to react to that. And finally, there's Syria, Iraq, and counter-ISIL campaign. And as Turkey's southern neighbors face existential threats within their borders, Turkey's general approach has been to seek means to maximize influence with friendly cross-border agents while seeking to deter cross-border adversaries from posturing near the border, be those adversaries ISIL, Kurds, or the Syrian regime. And as they've shifted stance and approaches towards each over the course of the conflict, one can find elements of nearly every component of the civil-military landscape in contemporary Turkey influencing their moves. Most prominently on display, of course, has been a delicate balancing act between nationalism, Islamism, and internationalism in their cautious approach to counter-ISIL, the counter-ISIL coalition, relations with KRG in northern Iraq, and the Syrian peace process. So that's where I see Turkish civil-military relations today, and of course the question we are left with is what's next, and it's hard to predict. But some of the questions I'll be tracking closely to try to understand where things go from here in Ankara are, do Erdogan's decisions start to reflect a definitive preference toward a final legacy of Islamism, national unity, or political pragmatism? Does the TGS start to assert greater influence in the course of its counter-PKK campaign or in the event of intervention in Syria? Does the AKP find a path to constitutional reform? If so, what does the new National Security Council look like? If not, do the internal decision circles around the presidency eventually congeal into a construct that allows for strategic planning with allies and partners through a predictable process and defined civil-military interlocutors? Broadly, will the legal and bureaucratic institutions of national security policy in Ankara fill out to institutionalize the current de facto power-sharing arrangements in civil-military relations under the current players, or will circumstances drive civil-military relations back towards previous arrangements and concentration of power with the TGS? And answers to these questions are going to have obviously wide consequences, not just for Turkey, but for NATO, EU, and our bilateral defense relations. And finally, I'll conclude my remarks with a Turkish proverb that I'm fond of that I think pretty well captures the life and hopes of anyone who spends time tilling the field of security relations with Turkey. Patience is bitter, but the fruit is sweet. Indeed, I'd say maneuvering across the ever-tilting landscape of Turkish security policy and civil-military relations can be trying, to say the least. But with every tack or turn, the patient take a deep breath and try to imagine the prize at the end of that. And if the prize, in fact, is an environment of integrated peace and stability bridging Europe and the Middle East, then it's pretty sweet. Thanks for your time.
Sir, my question's for you. I have two questions, actually. The first one, looking at Turkey now and the direction that it's taking, we were talking about Kamalism, which was mainly about secularism and nationalism, but it's going more towards Islamism and also the nationalism part. The restrictions on the press, the problem with the Kurds. Would you consider Turkey a democracy or a dictatorship? That is my first question. My second question is, what's Turkey's role in the fight against ISIS? Because I've read that they're supporting us, or they're supporting ISIS. What's your take on this?
Yeah, no, so I guess to the first question, I would say yes, they're undeniably a democracy for now. They're their own form of democracy, and I think that they're probably the closest thing that we have still to a democratic Muslim, relatively secular state. With that said, there's certainly a lot of concerning sort of action that Erdogan is taking to sort of institutionalize a much more executive and authoritarian role of the president in that system. But there's still a hugely vibrant discourse, civil discourse in Turkey and public discourse, and you can see there, despite sort of that clamping down of the press, there's still relative liberties for the opposition to get their message out and have public discourse, and they're still abiding by the current constitution, which allows for quite a bit of civilian control over the system as well as representation in parliament. So, there's room for concern, but I think there's also room for hope. And really, the proof of where things are going are going to be in the constitutional reforms, and if they do in fact get through constitutional reforms. And I think that's a great example of democracy in today's Turkey, is that Erdogan really had hoped to have a constitution in place immediately after his assumption of the presidency, and the 2 rounds of elections rebuffed those ambitions pretty effectively. And so they're trying to figure out, they're maneuvering to get to the end state, but they may or may not be able to get there. So that's the first question. And to the second question about where Turkey stands on ISIL, I think oftentimes it's misinterpreted. And Turkey certainly has been, at the very beginning of the counter-ISIL campaign, Turkey was largely ambivalent to ISIL. I wouldn't say they embraced them, but they considered themselves to have some degree of an accommodation with them, and they didn't want to inspire additional attacks in Turkey by taking an overtly sort of aggressive stance towards them. Now they've shifted, and they've become more definitively part of it with hosting U.S. strikes from Turkey and strike aircraft, as well as a host of other forces. But as I said, as I listed the security challenges, I do that purposely to give the perspective from Ankara of the threats. And the reason that it's oftentimes misinterpreted here or interpreted, we have a difficult time interpreting it, is ISIL is about 3rd or 4th on the list of security threats that they are concerned about. And the number 1 threat for them is undeniably the PKK. And then 2nd and 3rd is probably the migrant issue and Russia, and then comes ISIL. So, you know, they are certainly counter-ISIL, or they're certainly against ISIL, and they would like to see them defeated, but they have other priorities that they're weighing that against as they pursue those objectives.
Dr. Scoboll, sir, I was wondering about your point about members of the PLA kind of being attracted to U.S. values, especially having a national army. And I was kind of wondering if you could clarify, to what extent does that sentiment exist actually in the ranks of like the PLA, and like how does that play out?
Very good question. As one of the pioneers in civil military relations said, researching in the military isn't easy. Even if it's your own military, it's a semi-closed institution is what Al Stepp would call it. And so, to my knowledge, only one Western researcher has done interviews in the PLA. And that's a Swedish, recently newly minted Swedish PhD, and her dissertation is fascinating. And I'm hoping that some of her stuff will get published soon. So how do I know? Well, what's interesting, if you look back, especially back to 1989, which was obviously a key year for the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party because of the Tiananmen incident, euphemistically, the mass popular demonstrations that ended tragically in bloodshed in Tiananmen Square. But especially ever since then, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, what you've seen emphasized in official speeches, in Chinese Communist Party outlets, media outlets, and PLA outlets, over and over again, is the party, the army must obey the party, and then almost always there is criticism, condemnation of 国家化, which means nationalization or statification of the military, and concurrently, often it's a depoliticization of the military, 非政治化. And so what that means is they're worried about, what I take that to mean is that the civilian leaders of China are really concerned about the loyalty of the PLA. I don't think they need to be worried, because what's the alternative? There is no alternative to Communist Party rule at this particular point in time. But again, what's significant is there's this worry. Why is there this worry? Because I think, as I characterized it to a senior member of the IC some years ago, he said, "How do you know? What's going on here?" And I said, "How would you describe this idea of nationalization of the military in China? How would you characterize it?" And I repeat what I told him, and that is that it's an idea that will not die. Right? So, again, to emphasize, it doesn't mean that there's going to be. We heard talk about there have been no coups in the military coups in the United States. That's good news, right? Well, obviously there have been no coups in China in recent memory, and that's good. But there's a lot of turmoil going on within the PLA, and that's been heightened by the recently announced reforms. And one big factor driving those reforms, as I mentioned earlier, is to try and make the centralize the power of the Central Military Commission and the chairman of that commission. And so there are fewer independent kingdoms, if you like, in terms of military regions and in terms of general departments. So go back to your question very quickly, and that is, why would there be any need for official propaganda outlets to continually condemn the idea of a national military? I think the reason is because there's a sense there. There's a sense that within the ranks of the PLA, there's a desire to be a truly, a modern major general. And what does that mean? It means to be a national military, like the U.S. military.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists. And ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy a break until 15:15.